All right, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Awesome. Well, welcome to RSA Conference 2024. I hope everybody had a chance to go down to the expo and get some free stuff. Also, there's going to be, obviously, I'm sure everybody's had breakfast and coffee and all the fun stuff, right? So, yeah, and please try to, enjoy yourself, have fun. This is the last day, so I know a lot of people probably went partying last night, so I'm probably seeing a couple of hangover faces here, which is okay. So make sure you get your coffee. So my name is Michael. I work with the RSA conference team. I'll be kind of like the moderator here. So just a few housekeeping rules to throw out there. Anything that you bring in, just please take it with you. So if you brought your shoes in and you still don't want it, just take your shoes with you. Also, coffee, food, whatever wrappers, please take them with you. Also, if you have a session right after this, which is in the same room, you still have to go out and come back in so that we can rescan your badge for you to come in, so you can't stay in here. So, all right. So I want to welcome our guests from the SANS Institute. So I hope you guys have a great conference and enjoy the speaker. All right. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to appreciate you being here again on a day where there's a lot going on. I appreciate you taking the time just to spend a little time with us today and talk a little bit about standards, which I know isn't always the most exciting conversation, but I think it's useful. I legitimately think this is a useful conversation. So that's why I'm here, and I'm hopefully get a chance to talk with you guys about that as well today. My name is James Tarala. I've had the privilege of, I was listening to Ed SCOTUS last night and realized that this is probably about the 15th year I've been presenting here. So excited to be here with you all from the SANS Institute and talk about some of the research we've been working on, some of the partnerships we've been putting together to get resources into your hands. And the hope of really what this is all about is we want to make your lives easier. And this is a message, especially for me, that's been important because a lot of the work that I've been doing, whether it's with Center for Net Security or SANS or others, has been to try to put resources into people like yours' hands, and something that I thought would be useful for me as I worked through my career. And so our hope is, with some of the things that we're going to be sharing with you today, is that these are things you can practically take back to your offices and just make lives a little bit easier for the things that you're working on. The area of research that we want to talk about today, though, is around standardization. It's around looking at some of the frameworks that are out there for cybersecurity and how we use those to make better decisions. And that's really what this comes down to for me, is I want us to be able to use this information not just as a sort of an interesting academic study, which I think it is, but it's something, though, that we can go back and say, this is going to actually influence how we do business in our organizations. Standards don't seem exciting, right? Frameworks don't seem exciting. Legal things that come out, regulatory standards, again, it seems like a compliance exercise and people don't get excited about it, which is fine. But those things drive our behaviors and influence the resources that we put into place to actually defend ourselves. And that's why, to me, this actually matters. Because if the standards start to say things consistently, then there's a chance we're going to probably do those things. And if things that are ignored by standards, there's a much greater chance that we in our organizations going to ignore those as well. So that's what we want to talk about today, and so hopefully we have an opportunity to talk about some of those things as we go through today. Again, we have our disclaimer, of course, as well. All right, so again, most of us know, I think, that there's literally dozens of standards that we have available to us. So if you were given the responsibility this afternoon to go back to your company and say, okay, we have to figure out what are the good things we believe we should do to achieve our goals, so that our organization achieves our mission, what would those things be? And you can go do a Google search and you would find that literally there are dozens, more than dozens of these standards that are out there that you could use as a starting point. In fact, in the catalog that we're maintaining today, I know it's not complete and I don't want to pretend that it is, but we've probably got close to 94 standards in the database today. And those are just the things that people talk to me about a lot. So those aren't some of the weird, say, international standards or maybe some of the state standards. I've got a few state standards in the database, but that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as what's out there, what we can actually do. And I heard a comment a couple years ago, actually here at RSA, where a speaker got up, actually a friend of mine, and said, listen, if you're going to go out and defend yourself, here's what you need to do. Pick a standard, pick one of the big ones, an ISO or a NIST or something like that, CIS controls or something. Pick one, run with it, basically you'll be fine. They're basically all created the same. And that was the statement that I heard. And I've heard that mindset repeated over and over and over again. And I pulled the friend aside and I said, listen, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't actually think that's true. I think if you actually read the standards, look what they're asking us to do, you're going to see some very large differences that are going to influence the way that we do business. And his mindset's changed recently, but I think what it happens is then, as organizations, we don't really think it's that big of a deal. Our board, I have a company that I work with, they were using the CIS controls for a lot of years, and that was sort of their North Star, and then they got a new board member. And the board member said, well, we need to use the NIST CSF because that's what I was used to in the last board that I was serving on. And the organization said, well, okay, well that's what the board wants, so the board wants the CSF, so that's what we're gonna do. And which is fine. No one thought it was a big deal. We'll shift our priorities a little bit, maybe change the way that we do measurements, and maybe we don't have historical data around the way that we've made progression and maturity over the years. But at the end of the day, we're just doing something basically the same. But again, I don't think that's actually the case. And so the thing that ends up happening is it's almost like these standards have become popularity contests. And whatever's popular right now, say the NIST CSF because they just put out a 2.0, is all of a sudden super popular, and we're all talking about it because it's in the news. But we tend to focus what's popular rather than what actually works, what actually makes a difference. And the thing that mostly I'm concerned about is that we don't, as an industry, typically have methodologies for evaluating those standards against each other. And that's actually what I want to talk about today, is how do we go about doing that? What I'll do is I'll present to you some options. You don't have to like my model, and I'm actually okay with that, but I hope what you do is you take the idea of the model and either just adopt it, or what you do is you tweak it for yourself. And you say, you know what, I don't like the criteria you chose here, but these other criteria would be better. The thing I would actually ask you though is, if you have criteria that you think are gonna be better, drop me a note. Let's make it better. And the next time I give this presentation, hopefully we have better research to give to y'all. So, at the end of the day, where I think we are is this. I think what we do is we talk to people around us. I think we talk to board members. I think we're kind of in a situation where we haven't taken the time to really evaluate the standards, put them up against each other, and so we ask the people around us, where are we going? We don't have a map, we don't know where the destination is, but we basically know there's people around us. If I were to say, okay, what do you follow? You might say, I like ISO a lot because really it helps my third-party management stuff, and I say, you know what, that sounds good to me because I don't really have a better answer, let's go that way. And so we reach this point in the path where we say we can go left or right, which way do we go? We don't have a map, and everyone's going right, so you know what, let's go right. Because why not, right? We gotta do something. And I feel like that's really where we're at when it comes to a lot of this. So the goal is, again, we talked about evaluating the standards. I've been giving this presentation or a version of it for about 4 years now. Typically in the fall, I'm gonna give this talk. This has been an ongoing project that SANS has been working on for a bit. And so you can go onto our webcast page and see there's free webcasts. You can see the previous versions. But again, let's focus on sort of what's out there this year as a main idea. So as we evaluated these, like we said, we've looked at about 94-ish different standards that are out there. And so I'll tell you how I structured it in the database and such here as we have a little bit more time. But in this year's study, there's a lot of different standards that are there, but we have to focus on certain things. One of the things that I definitely can tell is that there's popularity, and sort of some of these are going to be blue chips, right? They're going to be standards that we're going to look at year after year after year. As long as somebody gives an update every, say, 2 years or 3 years or so, we're going to keep talking about them. But then there's others that tend to sort of fall off the radar. Not to say that they're not important anymore, but we just don't talk about them like we used to. Like I for sure, when I actually first got into cybersecurity back in the 90s, one of the very first things I had to do, and the reason why I was actually given a job, was because healthcare was going through a transformation where we started to have legal requirements placed on us. And so if we look at HIPAA and kind of what it was asked to do in the late 90s and early 2000s, that became a focus for a lot of clinical facilities especially. And so I started to look at that as a standard. And a few years later, maybe 10 years later or so, there was a very small update that the Fed had published. But after that, you don't really hear a lot of people talking about it. It's not that it's not important, it's not that we shouldn't be doing those safeguards, it's just, it's a bit of an older standard, even though it's still applicable today, it's not popular. How many talks have you gone to around RSA this week focusing on how to really do HIPAA well? It's just not a thing, right? Because again, if you look at standards and you look at what's being talked about, you'll talk about the CSF 2.0 because that's in the news right now. But HIPAA, even though it's just as applicable, and frankly, I would even argue that by law required more than the CSF, we don't talk about it. So you're gonna find that there's some differentials that are there, but you can see some of the ideas, just some of the thoughts we looked at there. Again, it wouldn't be useful to put up all 94 standards, but you can get an idea of some of the big ones that were out there as part of the conversation. Now this year, a couple of things that we did to make some changes is not only do we recognize that not all these standards are created the same, we recognize that they're not even created to accomplish the same goals, and we really can talk about maybe even categorizing these a little bit more. So one of the things that we wanted to do was not just do apples to apples, everybody's the same, everyone just sort of evaluate them against the same criteria. But we wanted to be able to say, let's evaluate standards against themselves within their category, so that if they're trying to accomplish the same goal, we can have a more intelligent conversation about how they relate to others around them, not just the standards as a whole. A hygiene standard, for example, is going to be very, very different than maybe a 853, let's say, as an example. In addition to that, we're also only going to give what we'll consider, and I'll say in air quotes here, comprehensive standards. We're only going to give them a grade. Because it just didn't seem fair that we were going to somebody like GCHQ when they put out some of their cyber hygiene guides. It's really good guidance. Or ACSC from the Australians, probably one of my favorite standards. Honestly, if you haven't seen it, go look it up. But if you look at what ACSC has done, again, it's law in Australia, super powerful, great for helping us prioritize what we're doing. But it's not fair to measure them against, say, an ISO. Because again, their scope is different, what they're trying to accomplish is different, the types of safeguards they're including are different, and it didn't feel right to try to do that. So what we're doing now is we're only going to give those comprehensive standards that grade, because honestly, as most of us are going out and trying to decide what are the standards we're going to implement as a foundation of our programs, we're probably looking at the bigger ones, the CSFs, the CIS controls, the NIST, et cetera. We also recognize, too, that some of these standards are rising and others are falling, I should say, in popularity. And so it's almost like you're dealing with stocks here, right? Sometimes stock prices go up, sometimes they go down. And that's what we're seeing here with these standards. Year by year, some are going to be popular, some are going to be less popular. Things that were really popular 10, 15 years ago, we don't even talk about today. So what we're going to do is we recognize, again, not all these are created equal. So what we're going to do is we are going to focus on the ones that we're going to talk about unless we're finding older standards that should be talked about that aren't being talked about anymore. So we'll include that in our methodology. So one of the first things that we did was we categorize these. And so we look at these and we said, okay, what's the purpose behind why the standards exist? Now, does this mean that is there some sort of inherent value in a category? I don't think so. But if it were me, I think what I would do is I would learn from each category a little bit differently. And instead, maybe in a different way. If I was in your shoes and trying to decide what are the good things I should be doing as an organization, yes, I want to do CSF. Yes, I want to do CIS controls or whatever. But I want to look at the full scope because I might be able to learn a little bit. So for instance, when I was working on the CIS controls and the Australian government first put out the Australian Top 35, some of you might remember that project, they basically went through and they said, if we look at all the incidents that happened across the Australian government in 2009 when that project started, they said, if we did these 35 things, we believe we would have stopped 85+% of the attacks that are out there, which back then was a really good idea. And so when I was working with Center for Net Security, I guess SANS back then, we looked at those 35 controls, and Alan Pollard really wanted to make sure. They said, okay, well, if the Australian government really has this good research, is that being reflected in the project, in the controls that we're recommending? And so is there an overlap in that? And I don't know that that effort's really going on with a lot of these. And so if I was, again, in your shoes, what I would be doing is I'd say, okay, if I was looking at something like, again, I'll just use NIST CSF as an example, if I say that's my core standard, then what I would probably also want to do is go back to someone like the Australians or GCHQ or the NSA Top 10 or whatever, and look through those and say, okay, are the things I'm doing, say focus on the CSF, are those things from ACSC or whoever reflected in the prioritization that I'm doing from these larger standards? Because again, if I had a chance to listen, I don't know if any of you went to listen to Rob Joyce yesterday, and the NSA talked a little bit about what they were seeing this year. And one of the things, for instance, that they've been talking about a lot and CISA has been talking a lot about over the last, maybe 18 months, has been perimeter device compromise. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in organizations the last 5 years, and organizations have said, listen, yes, perimeter devices are important, but again, actually updating these and doing it more than once a year or putting them into other standards isn't that important. And I won't tell you which agency it was, but I had an agency approach us and actually said, listen, we really would like you guys to pull out the recommendations on network device management and network device security. It's just not that much of a priority. And to me, I can tell you in incident response cases we've worked, that is a priority. We've seen compromised perimeter devices used to exfiltrate traffic to alternate sources. And we know that they use those perimeter devices and have been for probably 14 years now, been doing that as part of their attack mechanisms. And so if that's the case, why wouldn't we be focusing on those devices? So I think looking at, for example, hygiene guides, if we're looking at how to sort of put these things together, what I would be doing if I were you is looking at different categories of safeguards and saying, what can I learn from these? And figure out holistically what's all the advice that I want to influence, what are the good things I should be doing to actually defend myself. Okay, anyway, back to the study. So when we categorize these, what we said was, one of the categories certainly should be these hygiene standards. And so you can see some of those that are out there. Again, you can Google all of this stuff and you'll be able to find most of these pretty easily. But again, so we saw some of these standards definitely fit in that hygiene standard. Basically, all the Five Eyes countries have said, here are the top things we think you should do. And so all their intelligence agencies have said, for this moment in time, if we could only do a few things, here's the 8 things or the 10 things or whatever, you should do these things, right? So the only one that hasn't is New Zealand, and I don't know why, but you can look that up, maybe talk to someone over there. In addition to that, though, we also see these comprehensive standards. And again, a lot of you've seen these. Again, whether it's a CSF or ISO, the CMMC stuff that goes back to 800-171 or 800-172, we could talk about that. CIS control certainly has been in there for a long time. I'll talk about the CRF safeguards here in just a minute. But these are going to be standards that are designed to be more comprehensive in nature. So in other words, we're going to be looking at things like, are they covering governance controls? Are they covering operational controls? Are they covering endpoints, servers, network devices, right? Are all these things included in the standards? And those comprehensive standards, for the most part, are going to handle that. Some more than others, but we'll talk about that here just in a second. We've also got some what I'll call cybersecurity buffet standards. And a lot of the regulatory standards seem to fit into what I'll call these buffet standards. Because what it feels like to me is someone looked at this great buffet of cybersecurity safeguards that we could put in place and said, you know what I want? I want a little bit of this, I want a little bit of this, and I want a little bit of this. And those things sort of put together influence what they created. And I know again, Alan Poller, who founded SANS, and sadly, as many of you know, passed away here not too long ago, would always say that people have their pet rocks. And people are going to put in standards the things that they feel comfortable with, the things that they understand. And in fact, if we look at a lot of the standards, let's give an example. How many of our standards today have really good guidance on DevOps or DevSecOps? How many people in our field have backgrounds in DevOps versus system compute security versus network security? Like, where did we grow up? And if we didn't grow up in DevOps, and we're not comfortable with DevOps, then we're not going to write about DevOps. We're going to write standards about the things we understand. Or what if we're talking about platform as a service? If the people writing the standards don't understand the nuances of platform as a service, are platform as a service safeguards going to end up in the standard? Simple answer, the answer is no. Side example here. Mobile devices. We've gone through all 90-some standards at this point, and if you say mobile devices are laptops, cool, some of the standards address that. If you say mobile devices are phones only, none of the standards address those. Do we think phones are important? Sure. Do we think they're the most important? I don't know, maybe not the most important, but should we at least be talking about phones? But they don't show up. But these are things that we can learn as we go ahead and evaluate these. So you're going to see this a lot, especially in the regulatory side of things. So again, keep an eye on those. And then there are going to be some that are a little bit more governance focused or really just almost completely governance focused. We had some examples like, again, the AICPA TSC, which is pretty popular, obviously, for our SOC 2 Type 2s and those sort of things. A lot of times very governance focused, which isn't bad. I don't want to understand the idea this is a bad idea. Governance is important, but sometimes that's what they're focused on. So what we did was, we went through a list of criteria. I won't read all this to you. I'm hoping they're going to make this all available to you after the fact. They are going to be recording the talk today, so hopefully we can get some of this. And we will put some of this up on the website so you can see things here as well. But what we did was, we went through a series of criteria to say, okay, is the standard doing these things? So for example, does it cover operational safeguards? Does it cover technical safeguards? So something like, for example, like a COBIT, nothing against COBIT, but if you were going to say as an organization, we're going to adopt COBIT, that'd be great. But you should know that COBIT's not going to focus on technical controls. So if you're trying to figure out how often should I update my perimeter devices, how often should I do patching or whatever, it's not going to have that conversation for you. It's going to talk about governing your program, but it's not going to talk about the specifics behind the technology. So again, if you're making a decision to make that part of your comprehensive strategy and you want it just to address the governance side, Great idea, I love it. But if the goal is to say, I want that to be my North Star so I can tell my engineers and my dev teams what they should be doing, probably is not the right decision. But so we're going to look at things like, again, technical safeguards. We're going to ask how often is this updated? I think that's important, how often we update these guides. So it has to be every year, but at least every couple of years are we doing this? Are we giving mappings away to other safeguard frameworks to understand how they interact together? Are they addressing some of the modern threats? As you walk around RSA, are the threats that you hear about, are they addressed by the standard you chose? My hope is that as you develop your strategy for how you're defending yourself, that when you come to a conference like RSA, I want you to have a great time and meet people and network and not be surprised by a single thing you hear. And I want you to say, yep, I heard about that thing about AI. I had to say AI one time to get the bingo card. So I wanted to be able to say, when that AI thing was said, I want to know that I already have a safeguard defined for the thing that I just heard about in that talk. That's what I'm hoping for you, you have that taken care of. So again, you can see, and then what we did is just behind the scenes, we created some metrics for how we're going to actually do the scoring and those sort of things. A lot of this is also published over at a site, crfsecure.org, relatively new site. Many of you know that a lot of the research we put out over the years was based on Excel, because that's just what we did. And so we would come to conferences like this, and I would give you Excel sheets and give you Excel tools you could use and different things. And what we found is that it wasn't scaling the way that I wanted it to. And so that was becoming part of our challenge as we addressed some of this. And so what we wanted to be able to do is find a way to give you guys resources and be able to do it in a way a little bit more programmatic in nature. But what we did was we got a group of people together, a lot of the same people who helped with the CIS controls, SANS, INS, Microsoft, Red Canary, Verizon, just had a lot of good folks sort of helping participate and give us some feedback on this. You're going to see more research coming out this way, but the idea is we wanted to be able to normalize this data a little bit more and do some of these comparative studies. And so we put up a site and a foundation to be able to handle that. But originally we were doing this via Excel. And at about 30 mappings, we realized it really didn't make sense anymore, right? And so you sort of build this big Excel sheet, and you say, okay, well, here's your list of all your safeguards that you think is right, and as you're trying to then compare all these 90-some standards, it just wasn't working anymore, and it just wasn't allowing us to do the things we needed it to do, right, obviously. And so what we did was we tried actually over the last year to then move that to a serverless architecture so we could actually make it more of a data analytics exercise. And so what we did was we developed a format, and you say, oh, did you do some of the common like OSCAL and some of those? No, I'm not motivated enough, to be perfectly honest, to create some of those standards. Like if the standards bodies want to create those and give them to me, like I'll happily ingest them, but like I'm not going to make everyone's formats for them. So we put this into like a nice JSON format where what we could do is actually sort of come up with fields that made sense, and then as many of you know, if you go out to find a cybersecurity standard, whether it's again from CIS or NIST or whoever, you download it as a PDF, right? And so how do you take that PDF document and turn it into something that can actually be compared against other standards so you can figure out kind of where gaps may exist, et cetera. So anyway, so what we did is we turn that into JSON, each of those PDFs into a JSON format, what was important, took that content, moved it into an Amazon architecture, and then that gave us the opportunity to take the mappings that we had created and then do it at much better scale. And so the cool thing now is if I had somebody the other day come to me from the Canadian authority, and they said, James, our standards isn't in the database. Would you put it in there? And I said yes. And I said the only requirement I have is number one, you have to give me some like public link to it. Like don't give me some sort of commercial resource. And then number two, it has to be in English, because some Norwegians did this to me a couple years ago too, and it turns out I am not a good translator. So I'm not going to try to do that anymore. It has to be in English if you're going to give it to me. But the cool thing is once I get that standard, now what we can do is we can drop it into the database and we can map it in instantly for whatever questions you guys have. And it can become a part of that study because the underlying code's already written to do the analytics. We just have to add something new to the database, which accelerates us now. Anytime a new standard comes out, we can just drop it in there. We've got an API for it. It just makes it a lot easier for us to give you this data. Up until this point, every time we do a presentation like this, we have to manually go in and look at the Excel sheet and try to come up with comparative studies and such. We don't have to do that anymore, which is kind of cool. The other thing we did was we thought, well, wait a minute, if we have all this sitting in a database, wouldn't it be cool if we could also just give you guys policies based on this too? So that was kind of a fun trick too. So what we did was we went through and we said, if all of these standards, again, if we can go back and we have these 90-some standards, wouldn't it be cool to be able to go in and say, we've got, I don't know, we're an organization that has to be responsible for ISO and AICPA TSC and PCI or whatever. And we worked with the SANS Institute, frankly, as they were doing some of their internal standardization because they had to respond to their auditors. And they said, we need to be able to give our auditors policies to be able to say we're doing the things that we're supposed to do so we can get ISO certified and we can get our SOC 2 Type 2. And so what we did was we just said, well, we have this database already created of all those standards. What if we can just reach into it and then pull out that information and just auto dump policies? And so Russell Eubanks, one of my coworkers, and I were sitting in London, and he said, well, James, we can already do that. What if we just used ChatGPT to write policy statements like whatever the policy purpose statements and the sanction statements and those sort of things and drop those into a different API? So long story short, we can just spit out policies for people and you guys don't have to spend as much time doing that anymore. And so I thought was, again, that these are the kinds of things as a community we can work on. It just makes it easier for you when you go back to your office to not have to focus so much on the minutia. You can focus more on actually doing what you wanted to do. So as part of that, then what we did was we took the different standards and we said, just like a minute ago I said, is that a lot of these standards just aren't created equal. And so what we did was we took a series of criteria, which you'll see on the left, I won't read it to you, but we took the criteria there on the left and we went through each of those comprehensive standards and we said, so if we have this master database that covers all the standards, so maybe back up a second. So we said, all right, so we took this thing where we said, we took all the 90 standards, we sort of aggregated them into one common place, and we said, okay, if you wanted to do all those things, roughly there's 400-ish things you'd have to do to be compliant with all the 90 plus standards that were in the database. And then we said, okay, so what if we don't necessarily take the opinion of what's right and what's wrong? We just take all those safeguards, put them in the database, we don't pass judgment on them, we just put them in the database. Then we'll compare all the other standards against that database to see what's positive and what's missing and those kinds of things. So we didn't want to play police officers to sort of what was appropriate and what wasn't, but we just wanted to be able to say, in comparison to the rest of the world, how are we doing? And so if we take the NIST CSF, so this is version 2, and what you can see is there's certain things that they do really, really well, right? So operations in this case, actually they excel at pretty well. And across the board, it almost feels like this is a bit of a buffet standard because what you see is they've got a fair number of safeguards sort of across the board in all the subjects, minus privacy, which again, you probably can't read it in the back, but that last one is privacy. And I know it looks like there's a little bit of a line there. It's actually 0. I just needed something so you could tell it wasn't, forgotten about. But basically, I don't think privacy was the focus of the CSF. So I think that's okay. But if we're thinking that privacy was the focus, we should know, of course, that that's really not the case, which is fine. Let's just be realistic about what it does. And so that kind of shows us from a safeguard standpoint, if we're trying to look at the whole, we would be successful in some areas, and other areas we would be partially successful, but there'd probably be things missing as well. We also did some things as part of the study. We went to Google Trends to try to understand a little bit better about how did those trends, or how does the safeguard compare? Is it something we're talking a lot about? As you'd expect here, you can see a spike at the end, which is really good. It kind of validated that Google Trends actually works. But over time, you can sort of see just this standardized conversation about it. But at the end, obviously over the last few months, there's been lots of conversations, granted, because it's been new. But you can see, again, a little bit more about just the usefulness of that. And then for each of these standards, what we did is we went through and we did that criteria sort of grading against some of those standards. There's some other things we put in place as well, but you can kind of see what's in place for that standard. We did that for others, and again, I won't go through the research. I'm going to flip through some slides at the end. Again, these resources will be available to you later. But just in general, though, this is sort of what we came up with in going through those standards. And so I guess what I was hoping that we could do with this is, number one, understand how are we doing, where are things at. I really didn't mean for everything to sort of gravitate for the middle, being C and C minuses, like that really wasn't our intention. It kind of felt unsexy at the end, I guess. But what it did is it helped us to understand, if we go back and look at some of the safeguards that were in, or some of the scores that we put in place, you can see that there are some things on this list that they do quite well on, other things they don't. And I don't even know that we should do well on all these things. I just want us to have a realistic conversation about what's capable. So again, like if I give them an F on privacy controls, it's not a judgment on NIST. We just have to be realistic and all know that that's not a focus of that framework. Now they have the NIST privacy framework, and if we want privacy safeguards, then we should absolutely look at the NIST privacy framework, but let's just not look at this one. That's all. That's all we're trying to say. All right, so with that being said too, again, you can see a couple trends just here, and I'll give you just a quick couple slides here at the end to show some other data points that we put together. Some of the standards definitely on the rise, if it's not obvious already. CSF 2.0, ISO is being talked about a lot. ISO is being talked a lot about right now because of third-party risk management. That's why we're talking about it. We're talking about it because the hope is that if I get ISO certified, maybe people will stop bugging me with those third-party forms. Okay, whether it's true or not, right? But that's why people are having that conversation. SOC 2 Type 2 is the same reason. 800-171, I always like bringing that up. I'm seeing more and more organizations outside the US government starting to talk about that standard. It's a good standard. It's one that doesn't get talked about as much compared to the CSF, but if you're looking at a pretty decent technical standard, I think that's one I would be paying attention to. Things I don't hear about as much, I don't hear about continuous diagnostics and mitigations. I love the program from DHS. I don't hear about it a lot anymore. 853. I hear a lot of people talking about 853, but I don't hear a lot of people doing 853. So again, nothing against what's going on in that program. I think if I were to pick any standard that had the largest overall score of comprehensiveness, there's no doubt in my mind 853 would be that thing. It's very, very good about being comprehensive, but I think what that does is it intimidates all of us. And so we're scared to look at something quite that large. HIPAA, COVID, obviously, we're not having as many conversations about those. What's in the news right now, of course, the SEC guidelines, the new version of NYCRR 500 or the NYDFS standards that are out there, NIST 2, right? These are the trendy things we're going to be talking about. And I think it's good for us to know about the trendy things. And it's good for us to know about the trendy things, ideally, that they would map against existing standards. But the thing I guess I'm hoping for is we're doing sort of this meta view of the standards that are out there, is that when NIST 2 or something like it comes out next year, wouldn't it be great if your boss comes to you and says, so I see there's this new NIST 5, or I don't know, whatever it's going to be called, and they say, are we doing that thing? And you took the time to already map it back to your existing safeguard library, and you know, yeah, boss, we got it covered. All those things that are there, we've already looked at them. In fact, the last standard that, as we've done the study, that did anything new, or that asked me to do something different than anybody else, was 800-172. It's the first time in a few years we were asked to do anything new or different. All the other standards that came out in the last 2-3 years completely overlapped with everything else we've been asked to do. And there's only like 2 or 3 things in 800-172 that were new anyway. It's like deception technologies and a couple of those things that they were asking people to do a little bit higher of defense. Things that we're still missing, application development standards, both in governance and technologies. We still, to this day, don't have great guidance for developers. If we're looking at what we're going to have to look at next and where these standards are going to have to evolve, DevSecOps, any of the cloud-based standards, these are things we're going to have to start talking about more and more. I have clients now that are coming to me as part of the assessment work we do, and it's been really interesting. More and more, especially the younger companies, are coming to me with endpoints, no physical offices, so no network gear on-prem, no infrastructure as a service, everything is serverless that they're developing, and then the majority of their business applications are SaaS. Our standards are going to have to adjust to that reality that maybe some of our companies don't have networks anymore, because some of them don't. But the standards don't reflect that today. So we're going to have to adjust and think about this as we're going forward. Certainly operational standards, physical security, privacy, these are all things we're going to do. My hope is, though, through all of this, and why we do the study, and why we have this talk, and why we put all the research in, was we want to get people like you in the room who are willing to listen to me for 15 minutes, talk about cybersecurity standards, to have conversations where we can hopefully solve some of these problems together. Because, again, none of these standards are perfect, but if we can work together to talk about what are the safeguards that we need to do and understand how those safeguards from the standards map into sort of these aggregate standards we have, then maybe we don't have to solve the problem individually and reinvent the wheel every single time. There are aggregate frameworks, though. Most of these are commercial, but you can look at these. These might be an alternative. So we'll throw a couple of standards out there. Again, some of these are free. Some of these are going to be more behind paywalls. But there are going to be some aggregate standards similar to the studies we did here you might want to consider as well. The other thing is I always like to give away free tools. Happy to do that here again today. But one of the things as well is we do have some free tools that we've been putting together. I'm teaching a lot of classes at SANS for a lot of years, and people have asked us to maintain these. But basically to be able to say if we do have some of these aggregate libraries, and I want to look at these in light of not just say a policy standpoint, but I want to be able to do an assessment of myself. Again, if you go to that URL, crfsecure.org, you can download these and see that. But what we're trying to do too is try to say not just which of these safeguards are going to be able to sort of how they relate to each other in scope. But one of the other big things, again, I feel like there's only a little bit of time here today, but one of the criteria we talked about in there was prioritization. And what we found was when we were doing the scoring of a lot of the standards, that only a couple of the standards actually did prioritization of the safeguards. Most all of them basically said, here's 120 things, do them all, and do them all equally well. And I don't think that's how we actually operate. But there's a few standards that are out there that did take the time to actually go through and do the prioritization. And so what we did was when we were doing the comparatives between them is we tried to say, okay, from those groups like Center for Net Security, for example, right, CIS Controls has some of their prioritization built in. And there's a couple other groups like that that are doing that. Not a lot, but a few. The hygiene standards and some of those, we tried to give them more weight. And so, again, not without going and showing into all of our work, what we did was we created a simple Excel tool that you could download and use. If you say, okay, if I want to use the prioritization from these standards and measure myself and see how I'm doing, how would that look? And so there is a free tool to go ahead and do that. You have to answer like 400 questions, but if you're willing to answer some questions of yourself, you can at least try to understand where are some of the big gaps in the program that you might have in place. So my hope would be, if I'm sort of giving a talk like this, I feel like there's just so much I'd love to talk to you about, maybe have a week with you or something to do this. But I think if I could just pick a couple action items I would be thinking about if I were in your shoes. Number one, I'd be thinking of what standards have you formally adopted in your organizations to this point? So is there somebody in the board that says you have to do this thing? Or the way I always tell it to people is, are there laws you have to follow? Okay, so think, are there standards/laws you have to follow? Are there contractual terms you've agreed to follow, whether you agree with it or not, but you said you would do it? And are there standards that you believe are the right thing to do, whether you're required to or not? Okay, identify that, get an inventory, figure out with your company, what have you agreed to do today? And then you can evaluate at that point, is that right? Right? And at that point you can say, okay, if this is what we said we were doing today, we agree that we're probably in this multi-framework world now where we're not just having to be compliant with one or two or three of these. Most of the companies I talk to now might have 7 or 12 of these things we have to follow. So, all right, what are the things we've agreed we would do today, and what are the ones that we want to do tomorrow to make sure that we actually achieve the objectives that we've set for ourselves? And at that point, we can get in maybe a little bit longer term. We can think about, all right, are these the right frameworks? Make sure that we have documentation, let's say policies or documented intentions that actually reflect the things in the standards that we think we should be doing, and then have a system, maybe a GRC, maybe some sort of tracking mechanism, something that we can use to go ahead and educate and track towards our goals. That being said, there's a lot of extra data in here. I wish I had time to go through this. There's no way we do. But if you can look at some of these standards and how we went through this. Again, I'll just kind of roll through these just so you can see them really quickly here as we finish up. But you can kind of see as we look through some of these other standards here, again, they're not all created equal, but you can see some of the comparatives that are out there as far as how they kind of compare to others in the industry. Again, they're all created for different reasons. Again, the comparatives are certainly going to be different as we see there, but just want to show you some of that data as well. Again, this is all stuff you can get after the reference or after the presentation. That being said, we've got a couple minutes left, not a ton of time, but we'll take a couple minutes for questions. Go ahead and let people go. If you do have any questions though, they just ask, we've got a couple mics up front here. So you want to go ahead and grab those, and we'll take as many questions we have in maybe 5-10 minutes here, and then we'll let you get on with your conference. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is more about cybersecurity program. Today we mostly follow NIST, and our cybersecurity program is based off of NIST, and we're looking at upgrading that or altering that to more align with 2.0.
Sure.
We also are regulated primarily by New York DFS, and we've kind of thrown around the idea of, do we just create the program, base it on New York DFS so that everything maps very simply, and then augment? What pitfalls or cons do you see with that approach? What things should we be aware of if we go that way? Or is that just completely stupid?
No. So all right. So NYDFS. Let's start on the DFS side. So DFS is going to tell you specifically to do risk assessments in 3 different ways. I've actually had a chance to sort of give them feedback on it. They define risk in 3 different ways that mean 3 different things. But what they've said is they want us to do, one of the definitions they give us is they say, they want you to do risk assessment for the purpose of safeguard selection. In other words, are you doing the things that you believe you should be doing in order to achieve your mission, right? So if our mission, whatever our mission is, technology supports that mission, cybersecurity supports technology, right? So are we evaluating ourselves to be able to say, what are the things we need to be doing to achieve that end goal? NYDFS is going to give you 5% of that. So if you want to be able to do that 5% to show the regulators, I think that's a good decision, but it's not going to actually be all the things you need to defend yourself. So I think you're going to want to augment that, and that's where I think, again, you go to those 3 areas, go to regulatory requirements, contractual requirements, things you believe you should be doing to achieve the goal. Take a minute, inventory those 3, and then make sure it's going to be comprehensive to achieve the goal that's there. And again, some of these resources will show you areas that are where you have strengths and weaknesses of some of the standards that are out there. But I think what you're going to find is you can start with NYDFS and that's fine, but it's only going to get you so far. You're going to need like a CSF, you're going to need a CIS controls, and even then, you're probably going to have to aggregate a couple of those together to actually achieve the things you really want to do.
Okay. Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, yes sir.
Firstly, as an Australian, thank you for Essential 8. Secondly, the over-commercialization of the SOC 2 Type 2. There's a SOC 2 Type 2, and then there's a SOC 2 Type 2 you can get from the back of a cornflakes packet.
Sure.
So what do we do about the over-commercialization of the SOC 2 Type 2?
Yeah, and I want to be careful not to have too many strong opinions in this. What we were trying to do here was just sort of do the comparatives so you could see the differences without putting too many opinions on top. But I think the reality of what you're probably going to see, and this is just if you ask James to pull out a crystal ball and to say what I think is happening, I think what you're going to probably see is, if I could say a trend over the next couple years, in fact, if I had a chance to be on Sands' panel yesterday, what I would have probably said is you're going to see people who are getting certified in SOC 2 Type 2s or ISO who have breaches. And someone is not going to be me. Somebody is going to do a study and say, here's the breaches we saw in 2024. Here's how many of them were certified. And people are going to start asking this time next year or the year after, why are we doing this? That's my crystal ball. But I think you're right. I think it's better than nothing, but it still doesn't address the issue. So, in summary, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this presentation. It's very eye-opening. Question around, so you talk about starting with, understanding what it is that you're committing to as an organization. Say it's, contractually driven. And so what happens when, as an organization, you've got all these contractual requirements, and in there is embedded security requirements around, 853, for example, and it's overwhelmingly in there. But as an organization, you kind of, look at it and you're thinking, well, there is no need to be 853. Like, how do you navigate, determining if what's contractually being obligated to do actually is what is supposed to be done, or is it because, like you mentioned, there's a lot of popularity contest with these things, like 853
Right.
is very popular, it's trendy or whatever, and most organizations are just putting it in there in their contractual requirements, not necessarily because they are a federal, agency or whatnot, but just put it in there because that's what's been trendy. How would you, as an organization, looking at all of those requirements, navigate and maybe push back or have some kind of leverage to say, well, we are doing, 171, or we're doing, something else that addresses this, but we're not going to do 853 because it's pretty difficult to achieve 853. Like you said, it's extremely robust.
Well, I think you got 2 issues in that question. One issue is, I'll just say anything outsourced or anything cloud. One of the very early cloud providers I worked with, I realized my company was their biggest customer. And I realized the reason we were saving money in that cloud provider is because they weren't implementing safeguards that costed money. So it turns out, never knew, like if you don't do IDS in the cloud, but you're doing it on-prem, it turns out it's more expensive to do it on-prem because, well, you're doing things, right? So it turns out a lot of times the way we were able to save money in these outsourced relationships was by not doing the things. So we swung the pendulum the other way and we started saying now you have to do all the things, right? 853 or whatever. The challenge is though, if somebody agrees, if we agree we're gonna do the thing, I mean, to me, we made a contractual obligation that we're going to do that thing, and that thing has a cost to it. And I would say that's a business decision that you need to raise that to your leadership and say, leadership, listen, you agreed that we're going to do this book, which is cool. We can do that book, but doing these things, it's going to give us a great architecture and it's going to cost us a lot of money. So please be careful when you sign your contracts. That would be number one. And ideally, you would embed yourself into that procurement process, or at least procurement would be smart enough to talk to y'all in cyber before you go ahead and sign those things. But if you're already signed, boy, talk to your procurement people, because here's the deal, none of us are doing it.
That's right.
So
I was just going to say, just as a follow-up, so we've got, building a compliance baseline now based off of 853 because we've signed on to things that we're not doing,
right.
And I'm looking at it and I'm seeing okay, this is, going so many different ways. So how, for the ones that are already been signed,
yeah,
how can somebody navigate something like that?
I think that's a legal question more than anything, if I'm just honest. The challenge is going to be that if you've agreed to do the thing, nobody wants to go back and say, we don't want to do the thing now, right? So you're going to have to talk with legal, you're going to have to talk to procurement and make a decision. Well, A, when renewal comes up, do we sign this again? Do we edit it? Do we do our best in the meanwhile and do as much as we can? Are we going to admit to the company that we're going to be in breach of contract? Or do you say, listen, we're all going to be in breach because we're all in breach. Let's just go back and fix the contracts. You're probably not going to have many people going back and fixing contracts, if we're honest at this point. But you do. This is really an attorney question. You're going to have to get them involved with that for sure. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Thank you so much for sharing the crfsecure.org site, and appreciate the great work that y'all are doing on that. So the CSF, the cybersecurity framework from NIST, is a framework for evaluating maturity. And most clients, customers, aren't accepting that as evidence of compliance with 853 or FISMA, right? FISMA, this FISMA standard is achieved through assessment against 853. So some companies or senior execs might not know that, okay, the CSF is just for measuring maturity. Same with CMMC. And then 853 is the set of controls that you would implement to achieve a more mature security program. So will the crfsecure.org website kind of provide that guidance instead of just calling things like standard/framework, because they're not the same?
So let me sort of back up a bit just to sort of give some definitions for everybody. So we could talk about timelines here. I won't go into history just for the sake of time, but so you have 853, right? So 853 at the end of the day is definitely going to give safeguards, right? So you're talking, 1,500 to 2,000 safeguards that'll be defined in that document, right? And they'll go through and they'll say high, moderates, lows, here's what you do, these different levels. And one could argue that there's a little bit of prioritization in 853. Maturity level might be a strong way to say it, but prioritization I think would be true. So if we look at 853, we definitely see that. Now, to understand CSF though, you have to understand where it came from. CSF came from a discussion from the Obama White House to say, we need to be able to defend critical infrastructure. And so the White House told NIST, you need to come up with a document that we can do that. And so they said, great, we have 853, let's use 853. And they said, yeah, no, you're gonna have to do something different. So they decided to do a public-private partnership, as many of you know. And so they had 7 meetings around the country. Everybody said, let's figure out what we should do to actually build this. I had a good friend who went to all the meetings, made t-shirts for everybody who attended all 7 meetings. And he said, listen, I said, why did you go to these meetings? And he said, well, my company sent me there to make sure that nothing changed. That was literally his quote to me. I can't tell you who, I can't tell you what company, right? That'll get me in trouble. But he said, my boss sent me here to make sure nothing changed. And what they did basically at the end of the day was they took a little bit from 853, a little bit from COBIT, a little bit from ISO, a little bit from the CIS controls, and they reference it. Read the CSF, it's all referenced. So they reference it all, and they say, if you do these prioritized set of defenses, you have a better chance of defending yourself than if you do nothing at all. And so they gave you that. Now, it's a little confusing now because 800-171 is sort of the same thing. The TSA guidelines are kind of the same thing. It's these prioritized sets. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen is you've got, in any of these standards, you've got a list of safeguards. In some of the standards, we have prioritizations. In some of the standards, the prioritizations can lead to maturity. And so what happens is you've got, all of them will do safeguard definitions. So 53, the CSF, they all have safeguard definitions, but then you're gonna have others that overlay prioritization. But the only ones that do that, if you look at it, are the hygiene guides, 853, and the CIS controls. Nobody else is doing prioritization. Everybody else just says do everything in the same order, principle of uniform protection. And so some of them, and then like the CSF, you have a couple of the guides, they'll do a little bit of maturity rankings on top of that. But it's a layered approach is what some of them are building, and most of them just focus on that lower layer. So, yes, sir?
Hopefully a short question, but so you talked a little bit about how the challenges that we run into with having networks, well, having deployments that didn't have traditional networks or traditional devices behind them, where we just platform as a service, software as a service, but no devices to link them to. And I guess, do you know kind of where the thought leadership is? Is anybody kind of gearing up to get a grip on that? And could I get, how would I get hold of them to get some early drafts and things like that?
For the sake of time, I know we have to close. I'll answer it really quickly. And basically, there is no overlying leadership for these standards that are there. Each individual body is making good or bad decisions based on their committee themselves. Some are addressing that challenge. Most all, 95+% are not. It's the state of the world we live in. So happy to talk more about it after the break. Thanks y'all for being here. I know you got a lot at the conference here. Enjoy the rest of your conference here at RSA.